Julius Robert Oppenheimer, one of the greatest American theoretical physicists in history. Throughout his extraordinary life, he made countless contributions to the fields of theoretical physics and quantum mechanics. In 1942, during World War II, a secret government experiment known as the Manhattan Project was created to spearhead the development of nuclear weapons. A selected group of people were tasked with completing the objective, and Oppenheimer was appointed director of Los Alamos Laboratory, later becoming well known for his contributions to the Manhattan Project and the creation of the atomic bomb, which would later be used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, claiming over 200,000 Japanese civilian lives. Julius Robert Oppenheimer was born in New York City to German Jewish immigrants on April 22, 1904. His mother was a painter and his father was a successful textile importer. His father was born in the Kingdom of Prussia and immigrated to America as a teenager in 1888 with nothing to his name. He was hired at a textile company and worked his way up the ranks to become an executive, eventually becoming very wealthy. Oppenheimer also had a brother named Frank, who also went on to be a physicist later on in life, similar to Oppenheimer. In 1912, his family moved to a luxury apartment on 88th Street in New York City, an area known for luxurious mansions. They were passionate art collectors, owning works of art by well-renowned artists like Pablo Picasso and Vincent van Gogh. As a child, Oppenheimer attended Alcuin Prep and Ethical Culture Society School. He was quite a versatile scholar who was interested in English and French literature as well as mineralogy. He finished 3rd and 4th grade in 1 year and skipped half of 8th grade, going straight to high school. He graduated high school in 1921 and entered Harvard University as an 18-year-old to study chemistry. Unfortunately, around this time, Oppenheimer suddenly grew very ill and was sent to New Mexico by his father to receive specialized treatment for his condition. This would be where he discovered his love for the open country and the southwestern United States. Although Oppenheimer majored in chemistry at Harvard, the university science curriculum mandated that science students also study literature, history, philosophy, and mathematics. To compensate for his late start to college as a result of his illness, Oppenheimer chose to take 6 classes per semester. As a freshman, Oppenheimer demonstrated an abnormal understanding of physics, even though he had no professional training in the field. Upon recognizing his extraordinary ability, Harvard decided to push him up to a graduate standing in physics, which meant he could skip the basic classes and go straight to the advanced ones. In 1924, Oppenheimer became interested in experimental physics due to a course on thermodynamics at Harvard, and went on to work at Cambridge in Europe to pursue his newfound passion. But Oppenheimer didn't have a very good time at Cambridge. He sent a letter to a friend that wrote, "I'm having a pretty bad time. The lab work is a terrible bore and I am so bad at it that it is impossible to feel that I am learning anything." He grew to hate his tutor at Cambridge so much that he went as far as to cover an apple in noxious chemicals and leave it on the tutor's desk to eat, leading to authorities being notified and nearly getting Oppenheimer put on probation. Lucky for Oppenheimer, his father successfully lobbied the authorities not to do so. During his little stint at Cambridge, Oppenheimer continued his studies at Harvard, and in 1925, after only 3 years at Harvard, he graduated summa cum laude with a bachelor's degree in chemistry. Although he had scholarly passions and pursuits, Oppenheimer had other personality traits that were terrible. For starters, he was a tall, thin chain smoker and would often neglect to eat for extended periods of time. His friends all thought he had self-destructive tendencies, which showed once while he was on vacation. A friend of his took him to Paris, but on this trip, his friend noticed that he was depressed and attempted to boost his mood with the news that he and his girlfriend were engaged. Upon hearing the news of his friend's recent engagement, however, Oppenheimer attacked his friend and tried to strangle him to death in a sudden blind rage. Luckily, his friend was able to fend off the attack, but this just showed how psychologically troubled Oppenheimer really was. His brothers showed concern for him as well, but each time he did, Oppenheimer would brush off his concerns by saying, I need physics more than friends. After his vacation to Paris, Oppenheimer chose to leave Cambridge in 1926 to study theoretical physics under Max Born at one of the world's leading centers for the field, the University of Göttingen in Germany. His participation in university was described as being overly passionate, to the point where it was disruptive to everyone else in the class. His classmates found it so irritating that they all unanimously signed a petition threatening to boycott the professor if Oppenheimer wasn't forced to quiet down. In and out of class, Oppenheimer did important scientific work in complex fields like theoretical astronomy, general relativity, nuclear physics, spectroscopy, quantum field theory, quantum electrodynamics, and mathematics of relativistic quantum mechanics. He earned his PhD in physics in 1927 when he was 23 years old. Born and Oppenheimer did a lot of research together after he earned his PhD, publishing their famous paper on the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, which concluded that nuclear motion and electronic motion are separate in regards to the mathematical treatment of molecules, allowing for further calculations about molecules from that point on to neglect nuclear motion, and this remains Oppenheimer's most cited work to this day. He was awarded the United States National Research Council Fellowship at Caltech later that year, but scholars at Harvard desperately wanted him to do his fellowship at their university instead. To compromise, Oppenheimer split his fellowship between Harvard and Caltech from 1927 to 1928. During this time, he did research on chemical bonds, mathematics, quantum mechanics, and the continuous spectrum, while also traveling the world by giving lectures in different languages in the Netherlands and in Zurich. Once he returned to the US, he planned on becoming an associate professor at the University of California, Berkeley. But before starting his professorship, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, which at this time was typically a death sentence if it was too severe. But fortunately for Oppenheimer, he had only a mild diagnosis. To recover, he went with his brother Frank to rest on a New Mexico ranch that he was leasing and eventually purchased. To Oppenheimer, the two greatest loves in his life were physics and the desert country. After recovering from his tuberculosis, he returned to Berkeley and began teaching. Oppenheimer was known for liking things that were difficult and complicated. His students and colleagues described him as a genius and an intellectually mesmerizing individual with incredible passion for his broad interests. He was a hypnotic individual in private, but a rather timid and shy individual in public. One of his colleagues, Hans Bethe, described him by saying he always knew what were the important problems. As shown by his choice of subjects, he truly lived with those problems, struggling for a solution, and he communicated his concern to the group. He was interested in everything, and in one afternoon, they might discuss quantum electrodynamics, cosmic rays, electron pair production, and nuclear physics. Across the academic disciplines, Oppenheimer remained intensely fascinated, but one area he never really cared much for was politics. In fact, Oppenheimer was so uninterested in politics that he didn't even know about the 1929 Wall Street crash until he was walking down a sidewalk with a friend and overheard someone talking about it 6 months after it had happened. However, in 1934, he started earmarking 3% of his annual salary to support German physicists who were fleeing Hitler's regime. He also tried to get Bob Serber a position at Berkeley, but was repeatedly blocked by Burge, who cited his reasoning for the block by saying, "One Jew in the department was enough." Although Oppenheimer was never intensely fascinated with politics, he did support social reforms that closely aligned with communist ideals. He never openly supported the Communist Party, but he did donate to left-wing causes in the Spanish Civil War. He was a member of a secret discussion group at Berkeley that was later identified to be a closed and secret unit in support of the Communist Party for Berkeley's faculty. Oppenheimer described himself as someone who was sympathetic to the goals of communism, but wasn't willing to blindly follow orders from a dictator. Between 1926 and 1939, Oppenheimer's research disproved previously held notions of physics and the universe, making scientific discoveries that contradicted the incumbent academic conclusions but were later proven to be correct. Starting in 1926, he was mainly curious about the nature of the continuous spectrum. Through his research, he found a way to calculate the transition probabilities concerning quantum theory of molecular band spectra, as well as photoelectric effect of X-rays and hydrogen, obtaining an absorption coefficient at the K-edge. In layman's terms, his calculations were in line with observations of the X-ray absorption of the Sun, but they did not account for the helium in the Sun. It was later discovered that the Sun's composition is mostly hydrogen, and that his calculations were correct in not accounting for helium. Oppenheimer did some integral research on the theory of cosmic ray showers that contributed to future descriptions of quantum tunneling. As early as 1930, Oppenheimer basically predicted the existence of the positron. At the time, the conclusion was that electrons had both a positive charge and a negative charge, but Oppenheimer's research contradicted this finding. He rejected the idea that positively charged electrons were just protons, due to the fact that they would have needed to have the same mass, but observations clearly showed that protons were much heavier than electrons. 2 years after Oppenheimer did his research, Carl David Anderson discovered the positron, receiving the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1936. Oppenheimer wrote a paper on relativistic theory of the photoelectric effect with one of his students, Harvey Hall, where he disputed the assertion that the two energy levels of a hydrogen atom had the same energy. Following this paper, Willis Lamb, one of Oppenheimer's doctoral students, later proved that this was a consequence of the Lamb shift, earning his student the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1955. Oppenheimer did research on the nature of space and astrophysics after being inspired by his friend Richard Tolman. He wrote 2 papers called On the Stability of Stellar Neutron Cores with Robert Serber and On Massive Neutron Cores with George Volkoff, where he explored the properties of white dwarfs and demonstrated that there was a limit to the amount of mass a star could have before it started becoming unstable, which would eventually lead to gravitational collapse, calling it the Tolman-Oppenheimer-Volkoff limit. In 1939, he wrote a paper on continued gravitational contraction, where he basically predicted the existence of black holes, making this one of his most impactful contributions to astrophysical research. In 1939, Oppenheimer met Catherine Kitty Pwenning, a former Communist Party member and graduate student at the University of California, Los Angeles. Kitty was married to a man named Richard Harrison, a physician and medical researcher, but Oppenheimer didn't care. Oppenheimer and Kitty would sleep with each other behind Harrison's back. She stayed over at Oppenheimer's ranch in New Mexico, and in the summer of 1940, she asked her husband Harrison for a divorce after finding out that she was pregnant with Oppenheimer's child. The two married in November 1940 and had 2 children named Peter and Catherine. But Oppenheimer continued sleeping with one of his old lovers, Tatlock, while he was married to Kitty. Up until this point, Oppenheimer was just a researcher, professor, and a father. But that was all about to change. Two months before the U.S. involved themselves in the Second World War, the U.S. government gave the green light on a top-secret program that would change human history. They called it the Manhattan Project. The objective? To create the world's first atomic bomb. In 1942, James Conant, chairman of the National Defense Committee and one of Oppenheimer's Harvard professors, asked Oppenheimer to join the project to take over on fast neutron calculations to create a fast neutron chain reaction in an atomic bomb. Oppenheimer, accepted the invitation, and threw himself into the position with insatiable enthusiasm. A few months later, General Groves, director of the Manhattan Project, appointed Oppenheimer as head of the secret weapons laboratory, the Los Alamos Laboratory. The decision was made in spite of rising doubts surrounding Oppenheimer's communist ties and lack of leadership experience. But Groves saw something in Oppenheimer that he didn't see in anyone else: ambition. Oppenheimer's grasp of practical aspects of engineering, design, and chemistry convinced Groves that he was the only man who could build such a weapon. Oppenheimer had been under close investigation by the FBI for his communist ties. In 1943, he was almost removed from the Manhattan Project because of his suspicious political activities. But General Groves said Oppenheimer was too important to the success of the project due to his scientific and engineering capabilities and could not be removed. He was quoted in saying, "In accordance with my verbal directions of July 15th, it is desired that clearance be issued to Julius Robert Oppenheimer without delay, irrespective of the information which you have concerning Mr. Oppenheimer. He is absolutely essential to the project." Over the next 2 years, the project grew from a few hundred people to over 6,000. Oppenheimer was forced to quickly learn how to lead such a massive operation, and soon became well adapted at organizing and leading such a large-scale administration of world-class physicists and engineers. At this point in the war, the biggest concern was that the Germans might have been making faster progress than the Americans in the creation of a nuclear weapon. If Germany got their hands on a weapon of mass destruction before the Americans, the war would be over. To slow them down, Oppenheimer proposed the idea of poisoning the Germans' food supply to try to kill as many of them as possible. But he reasoned that the risk-reward trade-off wouldn't be worth it unless they were confident that they could kill at least 500,000 men. The first iteration of the atomic weapon was a plutonium fission gun called Thin Man, but the plutonium's high concentration made it incompatible for use in a gun-type weapon. Oppenheimer chose to abandon the gun blueprint, instead for a weapon of implosion. The device known as Little Boy was completed in February 1945, and on July 16th, the weapon was tested for the first time in an atomic bomb test codenamed Trinity. What followed was the biggest revelation of a weapon of mass destruction that any human being had ever laid eyes on.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Upon witnessing the massive explosion, Oppenheimer let out a sigh of relief and said, "I guess it worked." Less than 1 month later, in August 1945, the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, which remains the only time when atomic bombs were used in any conflict in history. The attack killed an estimated 200,000 civilians. To Oppenheimer, the bomb was a marvel of chemistry and engineering. However, from a militaristic point of view, he and many of the project's contributors did not support the second bombing of Nagasaki, believing that it was overkill. Overnight, Oppenheimer became a household name, and nuclear physics attracted worldwide attention, becoming a powerful force that the governments of the world became obsessed with after realizing the massive political power that came with having a nuclear weapon. In 1947, Oppenheimer did some political lobbying to try and get the power of nuclear weapons under international control to prevent a nuclear arms race between the US and the Soviet Union. He also opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb from 1949 to 1950 due to the massive human casualties that would result from using the weapon. The United States government chose to go through with the creation of the hydrogen bomb anyway, and in 1952, Oppenheimer left the Weapons Committee and was replaced by physicists and engineers who supported the creation of the hydrogen bomb. As Oppenheimer was ousted, he began attracting negative attention from powerful people in the American government who wanted to see him crumble for one reason or another. This led to a security hearing in 1954 that was held to investigate Oppenheimer's lifelong associations with the Communist Party USA. It was discovered that the FBI had wiretapped his home, his office, his phones, and had been opening all of his mail since the early 1940s due to suspicions of him being an agent for the Soviet Union. During the security hearing, Oppenheimer admitted to having participated in left-wing activities with his colleagues in the past, but that he was not an agent for the Soviets. Despite his confession, the government continued pushing to paint Oppenheimer in as negative of a light as possible. Many in the scientific community at the time viewed the entire hearing as an unjustified attack on Oppenheimer at the hands of warmongering enemies and a general political shift of scientific creativity away from academia and towards the military. The hearing ended with his security clearance being revoked. However, decades later in 2009, it was confirmed that Oppenheimer was never involved with the Soviet Union. In fact, evidence showed that the Soviet Union had attempted to recruit Oppenheimer on several occasions, but they never succeeded. Oppenheimer had even removed several members from the Manhattan Project who showed sympathies for the Soviet Union. Although he supported many communist ideals, Oppenheimer's love and loyalty to his country never faltered. Near the end of his life, Oppenheimer spent his days giving lectures about science and the need for freedom of science and exchange of ideas. In 1965, as a result of his lifelong chain smoking, he was diagnosed with throat cancer, and 2 years later, after failed chemotherapy treatment, he passed away on February 18, 1967, in his home in Princeton, New Jersey. Oppenheimer committed his life to scientific research, but because his scientific interests changed so rapidly, he never committed to a single idea long enough to win a Nobel Prize in physics. He was a brilliant researcher who accomplished many difficult achievements, but many believe that Oppenheimer never truly reached his full potential. Nobel Prize winner Isidore Rabi, who had observed Oppenheimer through his years at Berkeley, Los Alamos, and Princeton, wondered why men of Oppenheimer's gifts don't discover everything worth discovering, and reflected that Oppenheimer was overeducated in those fields which lie outside the scientific tradition, such as his interest in religion, in the Hindu religion in particular, which resulted in a feeling for the mystery of the universe that surrounded him almost like a fog. He saw physics clearly, looking toward what had already been done, but at the border he tended to feel there was much more of the mysterious and novel than there actually was. He turned away from the hard, crude methods of theoretical physics into a mystical realm of broad intuition. In Oppenheimer, the element of earthiness was feeble, yet it was essentially this spiritual quality, this refinement as expressed in speech and manner, that was the basis of his charisma. He never expressed himself completely. He always left the feeling that there were depths of sensibility and insight not yet revealed. These may be the qualities of the born leader who seems to have reserves of uncommitted strength.